as the morning sun cast long shadows across Greenwich Palace as servants rushed through the corridors with worried faces. It was September 7th, 1533, and Queen Anne Boleyn was about to give birth. King Henry VIII paced back and forth in his chamber, his heavy footsteps echoing through the halls. He had broken with Rome, divorced his first wife, and married Anne Boleyn for one reason only. He needed a son to rule England after him. Hours passed like days. Finally, the cry of a newborn baby filled the air. A servant girl ran to the king with the news, but instead of joy, her face showed fear. Henry was growing tired of his second wife. She had not given him a son, and he was already looking at other women. She played with her toys and smiled at her nurses. She did not know that her father was planning to destroy her mother. They said she had plotted to kill the king. Everyone knew these charges were false. But Henry wanted to be free to marry Jane Seymour. He needed to get rid of his second wife, and he did not care how he did it. She was beheaded with a sword in the Tower of London. This law said that Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn had never been legal. If the marriage was not legal, then Elizabeth was not a true princess. She was now officially a bastard, a child born outside of marriage. She lost her title, her place in the royal succession, and her right to inherit the throne. Elizabeth was playing in her nursery when it happened. She did not know that her mother had just died. Her fine clothes were taken away. Her servants were reduced in number. She adapted to her new life with remarkable courage. She learned to be careful about what she said and did. She learned to watch people's faces and understand their moods. But in her dark eyes there was already a spark of the intelligence and determination that would one day make her the greatest queen in English history, and usher in a golden age of English culture and power. The bastard princes would become Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, one of the most remarkable rulers the world has ever known. She was only 2 years old, but she had already learned the most important lesson of royal life. In the dangerous world of kings and queens, only the strongest survive. She learned that survival meant being smart, not just lucky. These lessons would serve her well in the dangerous years ahead. She was moved from the royal apartments to smaller, less comfortable rooms. The little girl who had once been a princess was now just another child in the king's household, with no special rights or privileges. She did not know that her world had changed forever. She was now an orphan, with only a father who saw her as a disappointment. Elizabeth was too young to understand why her father seemed happier now. She did not know that he hoped his new wife would give him the son he wanted. She only knew that the palace felt different, that people looked at her differently, and that her mother was gone forever. She did not know that powerful men in the palace were working to bring down the Boleyn family. She was just a happy child who loved her mother and enjoyed her comfortable life. Court gossips whispered that the king was interested in a young lady named Jane Seymour. They took her away from the palace to the Tower of London. Elizabeth watched from a window as her mother was led away, but she did not understand what was happening. She reached out her little arms and cried for her mama, but Anne was gone. Anne's enemies grew bolder each day. They spread rumors about her. They said she was a witch who had used magic to make the king marry her. They knew that if the queen was found guilty, terrible things would happen to her daughter as well. A few servants who had served Anne Boleyn were sent away from the palace. New people came to take care of Elizabeth, people who owed their loyalty to the king, not to the fallen queen. The baby was healthy and strong, but it was a girl. Elizabeth was carried to the chapel in a rich purple robe. She learned to walk in the palace corridors, her small feet pattering on the stone floors. She babbled her first words in the royal nursery. Her nurses said she was clever and quick to learn, but her father paid little attention to her. He was too busy trying to have the son he desperately wanted. The Archbishop of Canterbury baptized her with holy water. Cannons fired to announce her birth to the nation. But everyone knew this was not the celebration Henry had hoped for. Henry's face turned red with anger. All his efforts, all his struggles, and God had given him another daughter. The baby princess was named Elizabeth after Henry's mother. She had bright red hair like her father and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. But Henry barely looked at his new daughter. He had wanted a prince, not another princess. England already had one Princess Mary from his first marriage. What good was another girl to him? Anne Boleyn held her tiny daughter and tried to smile. She knew her husband was disappointed. She knew her life depended on giving him a son. But for now, she had given England a princess who would one day change the world. Little Elizabeth lay in her mother's arms, unaware that she had already disappointed the most powerful man in England. The baby's christening was a grand affair. Noble families from across England came to Greenwich Palace. In the months that followed, Elizabeth grew from a tiny baby into a curious toddler. Life in the palace was not safe for anyone, especially for Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth was too young to understand the danger her family was in. When Elizabeth was 2 years old, everything changed. On a cold morning in May 1536, soldiers came to arrest Queen Anne Boleyn. The charges against Anne Boleyn were terrible. The king's men said she had committed adultery with several men, including her own brother. Elizabeth's nurses tried to comfort her, but they were frightened too. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed. Within hours of Anne's death, Parliament passed a new law. The change in Elizabeth's life was immediate and dramatic. But Elizabeth was strong even as a young child. Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne's execution. The little red-haired girl who had once been Princess Elizabeth was now just Lady Elizabeth, a bastard child with an uncertain future. Elizabeth's story had begun with disappointment and tragedy. But from these dark beginnings would rise a woman who would rule England for 45 years, defeat the mighty Spanish Armada. 4 years had passed since Elizabeth's world had crumbled. The little girl who had once been a princess was now 8 years old, living quietly in the royal household. Her father, King Henry VIII, had married and divorced another wife, Anne of Cleves, and was now married to his fifth wife, Catherine Parr. Unlike his previous wives, Catherine was different. She was kind, intelligent, and most importantly for Elizabeth, she loved children. Elizabeth was reunited with her older half-sister Mary, who was now 28, and her younger half-brother Edward, who was 7. For the first time in years, Elizabeth felt like she belonged to a family again. Catherine treated all 3 children with equal love and attention, regardless of their different mothers or their standing in the royal succession. Catherine Parr looked at the red-haired girl with gentle eyes. Most girls her age were learning to sew and play music, but Elizabeth was reading the works of ancient Roman writers. She studied Cicero's speeches and learned how great leaders used words to persuade and inspire people. She read stories of brave Roman women who had influenced history through their intelligence and courage. When William Grindal died suddenly of plague, Elizabeth was heartbroken. But Catherine Parr found her an even better teacher. Roger Ascham was one of the finest scholars in England. He had taught at Cambridge University and was known for his new methods of teaching that made learning enjoyable rather than painful. She studied history and learned about the great rulers of the past. She read about Queen Dato of Carthage, who had built a mighty city, and about the Empress Theodora of Byzantium, who had helped rule the Eastern Roman Empire. This was dangerous territory because England was going through religious upheaval. Her father had broken with the Catholic Church and made himself head of the Church of England. She lived through the religious changes that were tearing England apart. She saw how people could be killed for their beliefs. She learned that religion and politics were closely connected and that a ruler's faith could determine the fate of the nation. These lessons would prove crucial when she became queen. Elizabeth learned about both Protestant and Catholic beliefs, but under Catherine Parr's influence, she became a convinced Protestant. She believed that people should be able to read the Bible in their own language, and that the Pope in Rome should not control the English Church. These stories of powerful women inspired her and showed her that females could be strong leaders. She watched her father's moods carefully and learned when to speak and when to remain silent. She saw how courtiers rose and fell based on the king's favor. She learned to hide her true thoughts and feelings behind a pleasant, careful mask. She saw a bright child who had suffered too much for her young age. Elizabeth was polite and careful, always watching to see what people wanted from her. She was ready for the challenges that lay ahead, though she could not yet imagine how severe those challenges would be. She taught her that knowledge was power, that education could be a weapon more powerful than any sword. She showed her that a woman could influence events through her intelligence and learning, even in a world dominated by men. She studied mathematics and astronomy. She learned to dance gracefully and to ride horses expertly. She was being prepared not just as a scholar, but as a potential leader who could hold her own in any royal court in Europe. She could debate complex theological questions with learned bishops. She could write elegant letters in Latin to foreign scholars. She could discuss philosophy and history with the greatest minds of her time. But most importantly, she had learned to use her intelligence as a tool for survival and success. When Elizabeth was 11, she decided to translate a religious book from French into English as a New Year's gift for her stepmother. The book was The Mirror of the Sinful Soul by Marguerite de Navarre. It was a Protestant work that emphasized personal faith over church ritual. Elizabeth's translation was so good that it could have been published. She could soon read the New Testament in its original Greek language. She studied French and Italian, the languages of diplomacy and culture. By choosing this particular book, she was showing that she supported the Protestant Reformation. She was also demonstrating her intellectual abilities and her skill with languages. The gift impressed Catherine Parr and showed her that Elizabeth was ready for more advanced studies. By the time she was 10, she could speak 4 languages fluently and was learning a 5th. Elizabeth's first teacher was William Grindal, a young man who had studied at Cambridge University. She could translate difficult Greek texts as easily as other children could read simple English stories. She wrote elegant letters in Latin that impressed even the most educated men at court. But what amazed him most was her love of learning. She did not study because she was forced to, but because she genuinely enjoyed it. He was brilliant, patient, and amazed by his student's quick mind. Elizabeth learned faster than any child he had ever taught. She could memorize entire pages of text after reading them just once. She asked questions that showed she was thinking deeply about everything she learned. She spoke little and moved quietly through the palace corridors. But Catherine noticed something special about this forgotten princess. There was a sharp intelligence in her dark eyes that reminded Catherine of the girl's father at his best. The new queen decided to bring all of Henry's children together. Catherine Parr was not just a kind stepmother. She was one of the most educated women in England. She had written books and could speak several languages. She believed that girls should be educated just as well as boys, which was a revolutionary idea in the 1540s. When she looked at Elizabeth, she saw a mind that was hungry for knowledge and ready to learn. The Queen arranged for the best tutors in England to teach the royal children. Under Grindal's guidance, Elizabeth began to study Latin, the language of scholars and the church. But Elizabeth's education went far beyond Latin. She learned Greek, which was even more difficult and was usually taught only to boys who would become priests or scholars. Her tutors were amazed by her memory and her ability to understand complex ideas. Ascham quickly realized that Elizabeth was no ordinary student. He wrote letters to his friends describing her as a miracle of learning. Elizabeth's daily routine was filled with lessons. She woke early and spent hours reading and writing. She also studied philosophy and religion. Elizabeth's religious education was not just about studying books. Catherine Parr encouraged Elizabeth to write and express her own ideas. But this gift was more than just a translation. It was Elizabeth's quiet way of declaring her religious beliefs. Elizabeth's education continued beyond books and languages. She learned music and could play several instruments skillfully. Most importantly, Elizabeth learned the art of survival. Living in Henry VIII's court was dangerous for everyone, especially for his children. Catherine Parr protected Elizabeth during these crucial years, but she also prepared her for the harsh realities of royal life. By the time Elizabeth was 14, she had become one of the most educated people in England, male or female. The little girl who had once been a disappointed princess was now a formidable young woman, armed with knowledge and strengthened by learning. The year 1547 brought terrible news to the royal household. King Henry VIII, the giant of a man who had dominated England for 38 years, was dying. Elizabeth, now 13 years old, watched as her father grew weaker each day. Elizabeth's 9-year-old half-brother Edward became King Edward VI, but a child could not rule England alone. The real power went to Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, who became the Lord Protector. With him came his younger brother, Thomas Seymour. a man whose charm and ambition would soon threaten Elizabeth's very life. His massive body was failing, and his temper had become even more dangerous than before. Everyone in the palace walked on tiptoes, afraid to anger the dying king. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth could live away from the dangerous atmosphere of the royal court. She continued her studies with Roger Ascham and enjoyed the peaceful life of a scholar. But peace was not meant to last for the former princess. She had grown up without much affection from her father, and Thomas Seymour was charming and playful. But she was also intelligent and well-educated. She began to understand that his behavior was wrong and dangerous. She tried to control Thomas's behavior, but he ignored her warnings. The situation became more dangerous each day. Elizabeth was developing into a beautiful young woman, and Thomas's attention was becoming more serious and threatening. Both were only partially dressed, and it was clear that something improper had happened. Catherine was furious and heartbroken. She realized that her husband was trying to seduce her stepdaughter, and that Elizabeth's reputation and safety were in terrible danger. It was painful for both women, but Catherine knew it was the only way to protect Elizabeth from Thomas's advances. Elizabeth left Chelsea with a heavy heart, understanding that she had lost not just a home, but the last person who truly cared for her welfare. She started to dress quickly in the mornings and tried to avoid being alone with him. She tried to continue her studies and live quietly, but Thomas Seymour would not leave her alone. If people believed she had been involved with him while he was married to Catherine Parr, her reputation would be ruined forever. If she married him without the council's permission, she could be charged with treason. Either way, she could lose her life. He began to spread rumors that he was going to marry her. This was incredibly dangerous because any marriage involving a member of the royal family required the permission of the king's council. He had been plotting to kidnap young King Edward VI and marry Elizabeth without permission. She had spent her whole life learning to survive in a dangerous world, and now those lessons saved her life. She answered every question carefully and cleverly. She admitted to nothing improper. She claimed that she had no romantic feelings for Thomas Seymour and had never agreed to marry him. The authorities found letters and evidence of his schemes. Under torture, some of his servants confessed that he had been trying to seduce Elizabeth for months. These were powerful, experienced men who were used to breaking people under questioning. They believed that Elizabeth, as a teenage girl, would quickly confess to whatever they wanted to hear. Some of them, under pressure, admitted that they had seen Thomas Seymour behaving inappropriately with Elizabeth. But Elizabeth's consistent denials and her refusal to admit any wrongdoing gradually convinced the commissioners that she was telling the truth. She was now a young woman who understood the deadly games of politics and power. She had learned that in the world of kings and queens, survival meant being smarter than everyone else. This lesson would serve her well in the even greater challenges that lay ahead. The 15-year-old girl looked at the powerful men questioning her and said, "I have a good wit for my own preservation." She had learned that even people who claimed to love her could be dangerous. She had discovered that her position as a member of the royal family made her a target for ambitious men. Most importantly, she had proven to herself that she could survive anything if she kept her wits about her. These words showed that Elizabeth understood exactly what was at stake and that she was determined to survive. By suggesting marriage without permission, Thomas was committing treason. They told her that Thomas Seymour had confessed to planning to marry her. They said that servants had seen them together in compromising situations. They threatened her with execution if she did not tell the truth, but Elizabeth never wavered. She stuck to her story and refused to admit any wrongdoing. He had always been jealous of his older brother's power and position. While Edward Seymour ruled England as Lord Protector, Thomas wanted power for himself. He saw an opportunity when he began to court the recently widowed Catherine Parr. Elizabeth was devastated by the loss of her stepmother, the only mother figure she had ever really known. But Thomas Seymour saw Catherine's death as an opportunity. He now began to openly pursue Elizabeth, sending her letters and gifts, and making plans to marry her. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII breathed his last breath. The man began to pay disturbing attention to the 14-year-old Elizabeth. He would come to her room early in the morning while she was still in bed, dressed only in her nightgown. He would tickle her and play roughly with her, behavior that was completely inappropriate for a grown man and a teenage girl. She had been a good wife to the king, but now she was free to marry for love. Thomas Seymour was everything Henry had not been. He was young, handsome, and charming. He spoke sweetly to her and made her feel like a desired woman, not just a queen. Within months of Henry's death, Catherine secretly married Thomas Seymour. After the king's death, Elizabeth went to live with her beloved stepmother Catherine Parr at her house in Chelsea. Thomas Seymour was a handsome man in his late 30s with a smooth tongue and dangerous ambitions. Catherine Parr was lonely after Henry's death. Elizabeth was happy for her stepmother, but she soon discovered that Thomas Seymour's attention was not focused only on his new wife. At first, Elizabeth may have been confused by this attention. Catherine Parr noticed what was happening. She was torn between her love for her new husband and her duty to protect Elizabeth. The crisis came one morning when Catherine found Thomas holding Elizabeth in his arms in the garden. Catherine made a difficult decision. She sent Elizabeth away from her household. Elizabeth went to live with friends of Catherine Parr in the countryside. The situation became even worse when Catherine Parr died in childbirth in September 1548. Elizabeth was trapped in a nightmare. She was only 15 years old, but she understood that Thomas Seymour's attention could destroy her. The crisis exploded in January 1549 when Thomas Seymour was arrested for treason. Elizabeth was immediately placed under house arrest. Royal commissioners came to question her about her relationship with Thomas Seymour. But Elizabeth surprised everyone with her intelligence and courage. The commissioners pressed her harder. Her most famous response came when they asked her directly about her relationship with Thomas Seymour. The questioning went on for weeks. Elizabeth's servants were also arrested and questioned. Thomas Seymour was executed for treason on March 20, 1549. Elizabeth had survived her first great crisis, but the experience marked her forever. The teenage girl who had faced down the king's commissioners was no longer the innocent child who had once played in the palace gardens. The morning of November 17, 1558, started like any other day at Hatfield House. Elizabeth, now 25 years old, was sitting under her favorite oak tree in the garden, reading a book in Greek. The autumn air was crisp, and golden leaves danced around her feet. She had been living quietly in the countryside for several years, staying far away from the dangerous world of the royal court. For the past 5 years, Elizabeth had watched her half-sister Mary rule England with an iron fist. Queen Mary had been determined to bring England back to the Catholic faith, and she had burned nearly 300 Protestant men and women at the stake. Elizabeth had lived in constant fear during these terrible years, knowing that one wrong word or action could send her to the Tower of London, and from there to the executioner's block. In a voice shaking with emotion, he spoke the words that would change England forever. "Your Majesty," he said, "Queen Mary is dead. You are now the Queen of England." Elizabeth stared at him in shock. She had known this day would come, but she was still not prepared for it. All those years of studying history, learning languages, and watching the political games at court had been training her for this day. She took a deep breath and stood up, her royal education taking over. She knew what she had to do. Elizabeth greeted each one with grace and dignity, but inside she was carefully watching and evaluating everyone. She had learned from her dangerous youth that she could trust no one completely. She would have to choose her advisors very carefully. But Mary's reign of terror was coming to an end. The Queen was childless and dying, and everyone knew that Elizabeth would be her successor. Still, Elizabeth tried not to think about it too much. Thousands of people lined the roads to cheer for their new queen. They had suffered under Mary's cruel rule, and they hoped that Elizabeth would bring peace and prosperity back to England. Elizabeth rode through the crowds with a smile on her face, but inside she was nervous. She told them that she did not seek the crown for herself, but because God had chosen her to serve England. She promised to rule with wisdom and to put the good of the nation before her own desires. She knew that becoming queen was easy compared to staying queen. Cecil was not a great nobleman, but he was incredibly intelligent and completely loyal to Elizabeth. Elizabeth had won her first political victory, but she knew it would not be her last challenge. The real work of ruling was just beginning. She was crowned in Westminster Abbey, the same place where her father and grandfather had been crowned. She wore a golden crown and robes of purple and gold. She was now responsible for the lives and happiness of millions of people. She had to make decisions that could mean the difference between war and peace, between prosperity and poverty, between life and death. The Archbishop of Canterbury placed the crown on her head and declared her the anointed Queen of England. She made him her chief advisor, a decision that would prove to be one of the wisest of her reign. She had seen how marriage had weakened other female rulers. She had watched her father destroy wives who disappointed him. She knew that if she married, her husband would expect to share her power, and she was not willing to give up any of her authority. She said that she had given her heart to her people and could not divide her love between a husband and her kingdom. It was a beautiful and politically smart answer, but it did not satisfy those who believed that a woman could not rule alone. She looked up to see a group of riders coming toward her at great speed. Catholics would not be persecuted as long as they remained loyal to the Queen. She had to establish her authority without appearing too strong or masculine. She had to show that she could make difficult decisions while still seeming feminine and gracious. She had to prove that a woman could rule as well as any man. Parliament sent her formal requests to find a husband quickly. But Elizabeth found clever ways to delay and avoid making any commitment. It was a compromise that showed Elizabeth's political wisdom and her desire to heal the wounds in her kingdom. She understood that pageantry and splendor were important parts of being a successful ruler. The Catholics wanted to return to the old faith, while the Protestants wanted to continue the reforms begun by her father. There were Catholic nobles who questioned her right to rule. There were foreign powers who saw England as weak under a female ruler. There were ambitious men who still hoped to marry her and take her power for themselves. Elizabeth knew that she had to find a middle way that would satisfy most people without completely alienating anyone. The people needed to see their queen as someone special, someone chosen by God to rule over them. Foreign ambassadors wrote to their kings describing Elizabeth as brilliant, charming, and surprisingly strong. Her own people began to love her, impressed by her intelligence and her obvious dedication to their welfare. She was becoming not just a queen, but a symbol of English pride and independence. She was no longer the frightened girl who had once faced the king's commissioners. She was no longer the bastard princes who had been ignored and forgotten. She was Elizabeth I, Queen of England, and she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Their horses were covered in sweat, and the men looked exhausted as if they had been riding all night. Elizabeth felt her heart begin to race. News that came this urgently was usually bad news. She had learned that hoping for the crown could be dangerous. Too many people had died for wanting to be king or queen of England. She was 25 years old, which was already considered quite old for a woman to remain unmarried. The nobles and Parliament constantly pressured her to choose a husband. Elizabeth was still officially a bastard in the eyes of the law. Parliament had declared her illegitimate when her mother Anne Boleyn was executed. Before she could be crowned, Parliament had to pass a new law declaring her the rightful queen. This was not just a formality. If Parliament could make her queen, Parliament could also unmake her. As Elizabeth read her book, she heard the sound of horses approaching. She was no longer just Lady Elizabeth, the bastard daughter of Henry VIII. She was now Elizabeth I, Queen of England, ruler of 4 million people. The responsibility was enormous and terrifying. She was a 25-year-old woman in a world where men believed that women were too weak to rule. The leader of the group jumped down from his horse and knelt before her. Elizabeth fell to her knees under the oak tree, overwhelmed by the weight of what had just happened. But Elizabeth had been preparing for this moment all her life, even if she had not always realized it. Within hours, Hatfield House was filled with nobles, courtiers, and officials who had come to serve the new queen. Her first and most important choice was William Cecil, a brilliant and honest man who had served her during her years in the countryside. Elizabeth's journey to London was a triumph. The coronation was planned for January 10, 1559. Elizabeth wanted it to be the most magnificent ceremony England had ever seen, but there was a serious problem. Elizabeth handled this challenge with skill and intelligence. She called Parliament together and spoke to them with words that were both humble and strong. Parliament was impressed by the young queen's speech. They passed the law recognizing her as the rightful queen without argument. The coronation ceremony was everything Elizabeth had hoped it would be. But Elizabeth knew that the crown was more than just a symbol. It was a burden that would never leave her shoulders. Her first major decision was about religion. England was torn apart by religious conflict. She chose a moderate Protestant settlement. The Church of England would be Protestant, but it would keep some Catholic traditions that people were used to. But Elizabeth's greatest challenge was not religious or political. It was personal. Everyone expected her to marry and produce an heir. Elizabeth listened to all the marriage proposals with patience, but she was deeply troubled by the question. The pressure to marry came from all sides. Foreign ambassadors suggested princes from their own countries. English nobles promoted their own sons and brothers. She told her advisors that she was already married to England. Elizabeth's first year as queen was a time of careful balancing. She succeeded beyond everyone's expectations. But Elizabeth knew that her real tests were still to come. As 1559 ended, Elizabeth stood at the window of her palace, looking out at the city of London. The reluctant queen had become a confident ruler, but her greatest adventures and most dangerous enemies were still waiting for her in the years to come. The music echoed through the great hall at Greenwich Palace as Elizabeth danced with the most handsome man in England. Robert Dudley moved gracefully beside her, his dark eyes never leaving her face. They had known each other since childhood, and now, 3 years into her reign, their friendship had blossomed into something much deeper and more dangerous. He could ride better than any man at court and was skilled with both sword and pen. Most importantly, he understood Elizabeth in ways that no one else did. He had grown up in the same dangerous world of royal politics, and he knew how to make her laugh when the weight of the crown became too heavy. Robert Dudley was everything a queen could want in a man. He was tall, athletic, and intelligent. But there was one terrible problem with Elizabeth's feelings for Robert Dudley. He was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived quietly in the countryside while Robert spent his days at court, serving as Elizabeth's master of horse. Everyone could see that the queen favored him above all other men, and the gossips were beginning to whisper dangerous things. Her advisors constantly reminded her that England needed an heir. If she died without children, civil war might tear the kingdom apart. Amy Robsart, Robert Dudley's wife, had been found dead at the bottom of a staircase in her home. Her neck was broken, and she was alone in the house when it happened. The official verdict was accidental death, but everyone suspected something more sinister. But every time she considered marrying a foreign prince, she thought about what she would lose. A husband would expect to share her power and might try to control her decisions. People whispered that Robert Dudley had murdered his wife so he could marry the queen. She loved Robert Dudley more than she had ever loved anyone, but she loved England more. Finally, she made the most difficult decision of her life. The carefree young queen who had danced and laughed with Robert was gone. In her place was a more serious, more calculating ruler who had learned that being queen meant sacrificing personal happiness for the good of the kingdom. She continued to show favor to Robert Dudley, proving that she did not believe he was guilty of murder. But she also made it clear that she would consider all marriage proposals seriously. She began a complex game of diplomatic courtship that would continue for years. She could not marry Robert no matter how much it hurt. Others suggested that Elizabeth herself had ordered Amy's death. Elizabeth entered into serious negotiations with his representatives, discussing everything from religion to the size of his household. She seemed genuinely interested in the match, but she always found new conditions and requirements that delayed any final agreement. She knew that Robert was innocent, but she also knew that the truth did not matter in politics. What mattered was what people believed. If she married Robert now, her enemies would say she was a murderess who had killed an innocent woman to satisfy her lust. After her first husband died, Mary had married her cousin Lord Darnley, but that marriage quickly turned violent. When Darnley was murdered in mysterious circumstances, Mary shocked everyone by marrying the Earl of Bothwell, who was suspected of being Darnley's killer. She surrounded herself with poets, musicians, and scholars. She encouraged art and learning, making her court a center of Renaissance culture. But underneath the splendor, Elizabeth remained alone. He would always be her dearest friend, but he could never be her husband. Elizabeth had chosen to be married to England instead, and she would keep that vow for the rest of her life. By keeping several suitors interested, she prevented other countries from becoming her enemies. She told the assembled lords and commons that she had already joined herself in marriage to a husband, namely the Kingdom of England. She held up her coronation ring and said it symbolized her marriage to her people. She had survived the scandal of Robert Dudley's wife's death, had successfully managed multiple marriage negotiations, and had contained the threat posed by Mary, Queen of Scots. She had proven that a woman could rule alone, and rule well. It was a beautiful and powerful declaration that would become part of her legend. Each nation hoped that their prince might become the King of England, so they were reluctant to attack her. Elizabeth faced a terrible dilemma. Mary was her cousin and a fellow queen, but she was also Elizabeth's greatest rival for the English throne. If Elizabeth helped Mary, she might be helping her own enemy. If she refused help, she would be abandoning a kinswoman in need. It was a dangerous game, but Elizabeth played it masterfully. She would never know the joy of married love or the comfort of children. She had chosen duty over happiness, and though it made her a great queen, it also made her a lonely woman. The Virgin Queen had given everything to England, including her chance for personal fulfillment. Foreign kings would refuse to treat her with respect. The scandal threatened to destroy both Elizabeth's reputation and her reign. How could she marry Robert now without confirming everyone's worst suspicions? Elizabeth tried to hide her feelings, but it was impossible. When Robert entered a room, her face lit up with joy. When he was away from court, she became moody and sad. She gave Mary refuge in England, but kept her under comfortable house arrest. Mary would be safe, but she would not be free to plot against Elizabeth's throne. It was a solution that would create problems for years to come. The King of Sweden sent ambassadors to ask for Elizabeth's hand. The Archduke Charles of Austria expressed interest in marrying the English queen. Mary was Catholic, beautiful, and had a strong claim to the English throne. Many Catholics believe that Mary, not Elizabeth, was the rightful Queen of England. Mary had been married to the King of France, making her a powerful and dangerous rival. These were powerful princes who could bring England valuable alliances, but Elizabeth found excuses to delay giving them any answer. She gave him expensive gifts and spent hours talking with him in private. The Spanish ambassador wrote to his king that Elizabeth was obviously in love and was making a fool of herself. The situation became even more complicated when marriage proposals began arriving from all over Europe. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, was causing problems in the north. Elizabeth knew that she needed to make a decision about marriage soon. The crisis came in September 1560 when shocking news arrived from the countryside. Rumors spread like wildfire through England and across Europe. Elizabeth was heartbroken and furious. For weeks, Elizabeth shut herself away in her private rooms, seeing no one except her closest advisors. She was torn between her heart and her duty. When Elizabeth emerged from her isolation, she was changed. Elizabeth handled the crisis with brilliant political skill. The most persistent suitor was the Archduke Charles of Austria. Elizabeth's marriage negotiations became a crucial part of her foreign policy. Meanwhile, Mary, Queen of Scots, was causing more trouble. The Scottish nobles rebelled against Mary, and she was forced to flee to England, seeking Elizabeth's protection. Elizabeth chose a middle path that satisfied no one completely but protected her own interests. As the 1560s progressed, Elizabeth's court became the most brilliant in Europe. Robert Dudley continued to serve her faithfully, but their relationship had changed forever. In Parliament, Elizabeth gave her famous speech about marriage. By 1570, Elizabeth had been queen for 12 years, but Elizabeth's heart bore the scars of her sacrifices. The year 1570 brought dark clouds gathering over Elizabeth's England. In the north, Catholic nobles were plotting rebellion. In Rome, the Pope was preparing to declare Elizabeth a heretic who had no right to rule. Across the English Channel, Philip II of Spain was watching and waiting for his chance to destroy the Protestant queen who had defied the Catholic Church. The Earl of Westmoreland and the Earl of Northumberland, both powerful Catholic lords, were planning to overthrow her and put Mary Queen of Scots on the English throne. They believed that England should return to the Catholic faith and that Elizabeth, the bastard daughter of Henry VIII, had no right to wear the crown. They carried religious banners and declared that they were fighting to restore the true faith to England. For a few terrifying weeks, it seemed that Elizabeth might lose her throne to Catholic rebels. Elizabeth's greatest challenge came from her own nobles. The Northern Rebellion began in November 1569. When the two earls raised their banners and marched south with an army of 6,000 men, she did not panic or run away. Instead, she gathered her loyal nobles and prepared to fight. She sent armies north to crush the rebellion and made it clear that anyone who supported the rebels would be treated as a traitor. They had to choose between their loyalty to their queen and their loyalty to their faith. Most chose Elizabeth, but some began to plot against her. The document also gave foreign Catholic powers a religious justification for attacking England. But Elizabeth had learned much about leadership in her 11 years as queen. The Ridolfi plot in 1571 involved an Italian banker who planned to assassinate Elizabeth and marry Mary Queen of Scots to the Duke of Norfolk. Walsingham's agents intercepted letters and broke up the conspiracy before it could succeed. The rebel leaders fled to Scotland, leaving their followers to face the Queen's justice. Elizabeth showed no mercy to those who had tried to destroy her. Elizabeth was reluctant to execute such a high-ranking noble, but her advisers convinced her that she had no choice. Norfolk was beheaded in 1572, sending a clear message that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. She knew that Mary deserved to die for treason, but she also knew that executing her would anger every Catholic power in Europe. She would sign Mary's death warrant, then change her mind and revoke it. Her advisers grew frustrated with her indecision. She told him to keep it safe but did not explicitly order him to send it. Davison, knowing that the Queen's life was in danger as long as Mary lived, sent the warrant to Fotheringay Castle without waiting for further orders. Hundreds of rebels were executed as a warning to others who might consider treason. She died bravely, forgiving her executioner and praying for England as well as Scotland. When news of the execution reached Elizabeth, she flew into a rage. Philip II of Spain, who had been planning an attack on England for years, now had the perfect justification. Mary had named him as her heir to the English throne in her will. He could now claim that he was the rightful king of England and that it was his duty to avenge Mary's death. She claimed that she had never intended for the warrant to be used and banished Davison from court. She appointed experienced sea captains like Francis Drake and John Hawkins to lead her fleet. She also began building up coastal defenses and training militia units throughout the kingdom. She traveled throughout the kingdom, speaking to her subjects and encouraging them to stand firm against the Spanish threat. She reminded them that they were fighting not just for their queen, but for their religion, their freedom, and their way of life. Every able-bodied man was expected to be ready to fight for England. But secretly she was relieved that the deed was done. His Spanish armada would consist of over 130 ships carrying 30,000 men. But she knew that the final confrontation could not be avoided much longer. Philip II was determined to conquer England and restore it to the Catholic faith. Elizabeth was equally determined to defend her kingdom and her people's freedom. The plan was to sail from Spain to the Netherlands, pick up additional troops, and then invade England. Philip believed that English Catholics would rise up to welcome their liberators. Elizabeth's admirals urged her to launch a preemptive strike against the Spanish fleet before it could sail. Francis Drake had already proven that Spanish ships could be attacked in their own harbors when he had singed the King of Spain's beard by destroying ships at Cadiz. The English people demanded Mary's death, and Parliament passed a law calling for her execution. But Elizabeth hesitated. Executing another queen, even a guilty one, was a terrible precedent. Everything Elizabeth had worked for during 30 years on the throne would be decided by the outcome of the coming conflict. The fate of Protestant England, and perhaps of Protestantism itself, hung in the balance as the Spanish Armada prepared to sail. The Babington Plot in 1586 was the most dangerous of all, with detailed plans to murder Elizabeth and put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. Each time, Walsingham's spy network uncovered the plot and saved the Queen's life. English spies brought reports of the massive fleet being assembled in Spanish ports. The invasion would come soon, and England's survival depended on Elizabeth's ability to unite her people and prepare them for the fight of their lives. The rebellion collapsed within weeks. The earls had expected thousands of Catholics to join them, but most English people remained loyal to Elizabeth. Mary had been her prisoner for nearly 20 years, living comfortably in various English castles but always under guard. Elizabeth had treated her cousin with respect and kindness, but Mary had repaid this kindness by constantly plotting against her. But the Northern Rebellion was only the beginning of Elizabeth's troubles. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull that declared Elizabeth excommunicated from the Catholic Church. The Pope said that Elizabeth was a heretic and a usurper who had no right to rule England. He released all English Catholics from their loyalty to her and encouraged them to rebel. This papal bull put every Catholic in England in an impossible position. Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, uncovered plot after plot against the Queen's life. The Duke of Norfolk, England's premier nobleman, was arrested and charged with treason. More conspiracies followed. The Throckmorton plot in 1583 involved plans for a Spanish invasion of England. Elizabeth realized that as long as Mary Queen of Scots remained alive, she would be a focus for Catholic conspiracies. The evidence from the Babington plot finally forced Elizabeth's hand. Letters in Mary's own handwriting showed that she had approved plans for Elizabeth's assassination. For months, Elizabeth agonized over the decision. Finally, in February 1587, Elizabeth signed the warrant and gave it to her secretary, William Davison. On February 8, 1587, Mary Queen of Scots was beheaded. Mary's execution removed the greatest threat to Elizabeth's throne, but it also had serious consequences. Philip had been building the greatest naval force the world had ever seen. Elizabeth knew that the greatest test of her reign was approaching. The Queen ordered her navy to be expanded and strengthened. But Elizabeth's greatest weapon was not ships or soldiers. It was her ability to inspire her people with her words and her courage. As 1587 turned into 1588, the Spanish preparations intensified. Elizabeth authorized more raids on Spanish shipping and ports, buying valuable time for English preparations. The stage was set for the greatest naval battle in English history. The summer of 1588 would test everything Elizabeth had learned in 30 years of ruling England. From her palace windows, she could see the beacons being prepared on the hills around London. When the Spanish Armada was spotted, these fires would carry the warning across England faster than any messenger could ride. On the horizon, a forest of white sails stretched as far as the eye could see. The Spanish Armada had arrived, 130 ships carrying 30,000 soldiers and sailors. The Spanish fleet was arranged in a great crescent formation that seemed to fill the entire English Channel. Under him served some of the finest sea captains in the world, Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher. The English fleet was smaller than the Spanish Armada, with only about 100 ships, but these vessels were faster and more maneuverable than the heavy Spanish galleons. The greatest naval force in the world was sailing toward her shores, and the fate of England hung in the balance. Within hours, every person in the kingdom knew that the invasion had begun. Instead of staying safely in London, she would go to Tilbury, where her army was gathering to defend the capital. Her counselors begged her not to risk her life, but Elizabeth was determined to share the danger with her soldiers. She would lead her people in person, just as her father Henry VIII had done in his younger days. Church bells rang in every village and town, calling the militia to arms. If the Spanish managed to land their army on English soil, her small militia forces would be no match for Philip's veteran soldiers. She was mounted on a gray gelding and carried a silver truncheon in her hand like a military commander. Thousands of soldiers had gathered to see their queen, and when she appeared, they cheered so loudly that the sound could be heard for miles. Everything depended on preventing the Spanish from reaching the coast of Kent, where they planned to pick up additional troops from the Netherlands. This was the moment Elizabeth had been preparing for since Mary Queen of Scots' execution. She told them that she had come to live or die amongst them, to lay down her life for her God, her kingdom, and her people. These were old vessels loaded with gunpowder and tar, set ablaze and sent drifting into the Spanish fleet. The Spanish sailors panicked, thinking the fireships might explode and destroy their own vessels. Using their superior speed and firepower, the English captains pounded the Spanish galleons mercilessly. Several Spanish ships were sunk or severely damaged, and hundreds of Spanish sailors were killed or wounded. A strong gale began blowing from the south, pushing the Spanish fleet northward into the North Sea. The Spanish could not sail back down the channel against the wind, and they were forced to sail around Scotland and Ireland to return to Spain. They cut their anchor cables and scattered in all directions. Then she spoke the words that made every soldier willing to die for her. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The invasion threat was over, but the Queen and her advisers did not yet know what a complete victory they had won. The Spanish fleet would suffer terrible losses on its long journey home, with storms, disease, and starvation destroying more ships than English guns had managed to sink. Spain's power began to decline from this moment, while England's influence grew stronger. The defeat of the Armada opened the seas to English exploration and trade, laying the foundation for England's later dominance of the oceans. The image of the Queen in armor, declaring that she had the heart of a king, captured the imagination of her people and of future generations. She had proved that courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The Spanish ships were magnificent and terrifying, but the English captains were proving that speed and skill could defeat size and numbers. These men had been nervous about facing the might of Spain, but their queen's courage gave them strength. Marriage proposals continued to arrive, but Elizabeth was now 55 years old and had clearly chosen to remain the Virgin Queen. She had married herself to England, and that marriage had proved more successful than any political alliance could have been. She had shown that a woman could indeed rule as effectively as any man, and that England under her leadership was a force to be respected and feared. The mighty Philip II, who had conquered Portugal and dominated the Mediterranean, had been defeated by a woman and her small island kingdom. She was no longer just the Queen of England. She was Gloriana, the legendary ruler who had defied the might of Spain and lived to tell the tale. Elizabeth's reputation soared to new heights, and England was suddenly seen as a major power that could challenge even Spain. She had faced the greatest threat to her reign and her kingdom and had emerged victorious. The bastard princess who had once been declared illegitimate was now hailed as one of the greatest rulers in English history. The streets were packed with cheering crowds who had come to thank God and their queen for delivering England from its enemies. If Elizabeth was brave enough to risk her life alongside them, they would follow her anywhere. The woman who had once been called a bastard princess had proved herself worthy to be called the daughter of Henry VIII. Drake and his fellow captains darted in and out of the Spanish formation like wolves attacking a flock of sheep, using their superior firepower to damage the enemy ships. On July 19, 1588, the lookouts on the Cornish coast saw what they had been dreading for months. It was a triumph of the English spirit, of the Protestant faith, and of the idea that a small nation could defend itself against a mighty empire. The defeat of the Armada became part of English legend, proof that God favored England and its queen. The Spanish admiral, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, had anchored his fleet to wait for the army from the Netherlands. But the English commanders saw an opportunity to strike a decisive blow. The beacon fires blazed to life, carrying the alarm from hilltop to hilltop across England. Admiral Lord Howard commanded the English fleet from his flagship. The Ark Royal Elizabeth received hourly reports of the naval battle as it moved slowly up the English Channel. But Elizabeth knew that naval battles alone would not decide England's fate. The Queen made a decision that shocked her advisers. On August 9, 1588, Elizabeth rode to Tilbury dressed in a silver breastplate over a white velvet dress. Elizabeth addressed her troops with words that would echo through English history. The speech electrified the English army. While Elizabeth was inspiring her soldiers at Tilbury, the naval battle was reaching its climax in the waters off Calais. Francis Drake organized a brilliant night attack using fireships. The careful Spanish formation was broken. The next morning, the English fleet attacked the scattered Spanish ships off Gravelines. But it was the wind that delivered the final blow to Spanish hopes. Elizabeth and her people watched from the English coast as the mighty Spanish Armada disappeared into the northern seas. News of the English victory spread across Europe like wildfire. Elizabeth celebrated the victory with typically English restraint. She attended a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, riding through the city in a chariot pulled by white horses. But Elizabeth understood that the victory over the Armada was more than just a military triumph. The victory also marked a turning point in European history. Elizabeth's speech at Tilbury became one of the most famous in English history. The year 1588 became known as Elizabeth's Annus Mirabilis, her year of miracles. Foreign ambassadors competed to gain Elizabeth's favor, knowing that England was now a power that had to be taken seriously. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was Elizabeth's finest hour, the moment when everything she had learned about leadership, courage, and statecraft came together in perfect harmony. As the Spanish survivors limped home to tell Philip II of their defeat, Elizabeth stood on the cliffs of Dover, looking out at the channel that had protected her kingdom. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Golden Age of Elizabeth's reign. England, once seen as a small and unimportant island kingdom, was now respected and feared throughout Europe. The victory had given the English people a new confidence in themselves and their queen, and this confidence expressed itself in an explosion of art, literature, and exploration that would make the Elizabethan age legendary. In the years following the Armada's defeat, London's theaters came alive with the greatest dramatic works in the English language. A young playwright named William Shakespeare was writing plays that would still be performed 400 years later. She particularly enjoyed the comedies, laughing delightedly at the witty wordplay and romantic complications. Francis Drake had already sailed around the world, bringing back Spanish treasure and tales of distant lands. Now other captains followed his example, seeking glory and gold in far-off places. Shakespeare and other playwrights sometimes included characters that audiences recognized as gentle portraits of their queen, always flattering but showing her human side as well as her majesty. Though his settlement on Roanoke Island ultimately failed, it showed English determination to compete with Spain and Portugal in building overseas empires. Though she could never marry him, she continued to rely on his friendship and counsel. When Dudley died in 1588, just weeks after the Armada's defeat, Elizabeth was heartbroken. The costs of defending England against continued Spanish threats were enormous, and taxes had to be raised repeatedly. In 1601, she gave what became known as her Golden Speech to Parliament. She had given up marriage, children, and personal happiness to serve her kingdom. Now, as an old woman, she was still working for her people's benefit, even as her strength began to fail. The rebellion was poorly planned and quickly collapsed. Essex was captured and charged with treason. In it, she reminded her listeners that she had never sought personal gain from her position, but had always tried to serve her people's welfare. She had loved him like a son, and his treachery broke her heart. She became forgetful and sometimes seemed confused about where she was or what day it was. But she refused to rest, driving herself to continue fulfilling her royal duties even as her body failed her. Despite her personal feelings, she knew her duty. Essex was tried and found guilty of treason. She spent her final days at Richmond Palace, sitting on cushions on the floor because she was too weak to stand, but too proud to lie down in front of her courtiers. On February 25, 1601, he was executed in the Tower of London. People wept in the streets, genuinely mourning the loss of a queen who had become a symbol of English greatness. She had transformed England from a weak, divided kingdom into a confident, prosperous nation that was respected throughout the world. She was 69 years old and had ruled England for 44 years, longer than any English monarch before her. Her last recorded words were, "All my possessions for a moment of time," expressing her regret that even a queen could not buy more life. She said that to be a king and wear a crown was more glorious to those who saw it than to those who bore it. The literature, music, and art created during Elizabeth's reign would be treasured for centuries. The spirit of adventure and confidence that she had inspired would drive England to become a global power. Most importantly, she had proved that a woman could rule as effectively as any man. opening the way for future female leaders around the world. Some people began to grumble that the Queen was too old to rule effectively. The transition was peaceful, showing that Elizabeth's careful management had created a stable kingdom that could survive even the change of dynasty. She locked herself in her room for days, refusing to see anyone. Essex had been sent to Ireland to put down a rebellion, but his campaign was a disaster. When he returned to England without permission, Elizabeth was furious. Essex was arrested and confined to his house, his court career apparently over. When she finally emerged, she seemed older and more fragile. English merchants sailed to India and the Spice Islands, competing with Portuguese and Dutch traders for valuable goods like silk, spices, and precious stones. These trading ventures would eventually grow into the British Empire, though Elizabeth could hardly have imagined such a future. Raleigh also brought tobacco and potatoes back from the New World, introducing crops that would change European life forever. The Queen was aging, and everyone knew that she would never marry or have children. The Queen became increasingly melancholy, spending hours staring out of windows or pacing through empty rooms. She complained that she was tired of the burden of ruling and wished she could lay down her crown. But she continued to work, knowing that England still needed her leadership. The question of who would succeed her became more pressing with each passing year, though Elizabeth refused to name her heir, fearing that it would make her seem weak or encourage conspiracies. His characters spoke with voices that seemed to capture the spirit of Elizabethan England, ambitious, passionate, and gloriously alive. Elizabeth herself loved the theater and often attended performances at court. Essex was young, handsome, and ambitious, and Elizabeth treated him almost like the son she had never had. But Essex was also hot-tempered and jealous, qualities that would eventually lead to tragedy. Christopher Marlowe wrote plays about mighty conquerors and tragic heroes that reflected the age's fascination with power and glory. Edmund Spenser composed his epic poem The Faerie Queen, which celebrated Elizabeth as Gloriana, a perfect ruler who embodied all the virtues of a great monarch. Elizabeth, who was an accomplished musician herself, encouraged this musical renaissance. She could play the virginals expertly and loved to dance, maintaining her graceful movements well into her 60s. English literature was flowering as never before, and much of it was inspired by admiration for the Queen. Music also flourished during these golden years. English composers like William Byrd and Thomas Tallis created beautiful works that were performed in churches and at court. The spirit of adventure that had helped defeat the Spanish Armada also inspired English explorers to seek new worlds across the oceans. Walter Raleigh, one of Elizabeth's most colorful courtiers, attempted to establish a colony in North America. The East India Company was founded in 1600, beginning England's involvement in Asian trade. But the golden years of Elizabeth's reign were also marked by personal sadness and growing challenges. Elizabeth's relationship with Robert Dudley remained the most important personal connection in her life. The Queen found some comfort in her relationship with Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, who was Dudley's stepson. As Elizabeth entered her 60s, governing became more difficult. Parliament was increasingly bold in questioning her policies, especially her reluctance to name a successor. Elizabeth faced these challenges with the same intelligence and determination she had always shown. The speech was Elizabeth's way of defending her long reign and reminding people of her sacrifices for England. The final crisis of Elizabeth's reign came from an unexpected source, the Earl of Essex himself. But Essex could not accept his fall from grace. In February 1601, he attempted a desperate rebellion, trying to seize control of London and force Elizabeth to dismiss her advisors. Elizabeth was devastated by Essex's betrayal. The execution of Essex marked the end of Elizabeth's golden years. Elizabeth's health began to decline noticeably in 1602. She suffered from insomnia and had little appetite. The end came in March 1603. Elizabeth had been ill for weeks, refusing to eat properly or take medicine. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth I died peacefully in her sleep. News of Elizabeth's death spread quickly through London and across England. James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, became James I of England as Elizabeth had secretly planned. The Elizabethan age was over, but its achievements would never be forgotten.